Welcome to Leaving Nothing to Chance, your go-to podcast where we bring you insights from some of the most influential voices in small business and personal development. Each week, we dive deep into conversations with top thought leaders, authors, and business moguls from around the world, sharing their secrets to success and strategies for growth. Tune in for exclusive content that will inspire, motivate, and equip you to take your journey to the next level. This is Leaving Nothing to Chance.
Dennis Henson, how are you today, bud?
Just great, John. Thank you very much.
We are still talking about real impact. And today we're going to be talking about Abraham Lincoln. My personal opinion as an interviewer is our greatest president. I would put him there along with a couple others. Teddy Roosevelt being another one. Ronald Reagan being another one. We certainly have had some others. We've certainly had some others that have been forgotten for good reason. They didn't do much. But Lincoln is a unique human being in the respect that he was probably the most unlikely person at that time to be the president for a lot of reasons, some of which you covered in the book here. I'd love your comments on why he wasn't the ideal person or the candidate of choice at that time.
He wasn't the ideal person. He shouldn't have risen to that level because his parents were illiterate. They were totally broke. His father lost all of his money in a land deal. They lived in a lean-to the first years of his life with a dirt floor, and he had less than a first grade education. So just that alone should eliminate his chances. But his political career was nothing to be happy about. There was nothing in his political career that would rise him to the level that a president would be chosen from. And he just had this charisma about him. And he had studied so much that he had a very powerful delivery when he was talking with people. He could get his point across. It was very funny. He could tell yarns. There's a lot of stories about yarns that he spun, and people just loved to listen to him and loved to be around him. He was a friendly person. He wasn't a good-looking guy. That wasn't something that, it's not Clinton looked nice. I think that got him a lot of votes. But Lincoln didn't get any vote. He didn't get the first vote for how he looked. In fact, his face was so shrunken, it looked like a skull, that one of his supporters came up to him, a lady came up to him and said, "Why don't you grow a beard? I think that would look much better." And he did, and he kept it for the rest of his life. But that and 1,000 other reasons he shouldn't have been. Some of the other reasons are, of course, you need to read the book, because time after time, something came up that would prevent him from being president. And then a miracle happened and he got by that. And it happened over and over. That's why the name of the story is Providence. And then the question I ask is, was this Providence? Or was he just lucky? Lincoln was not a lucky man. Look what happened to him. He was born unlucky, born into an unlucky family. And pretty much everything that happened to him during the first part of his life, he failed so many times. And he would get into a business and he would lose all of his money. In fact, he had the sheriff came and got all of his survey equipment at one time and sold it to pay his debtors. So that was bankruptcy of that time, which would, people nowadays think that should just disqualify you. But any businessman that's been around for very long has probably had some serious problems, and maybe even the extremely successful ones have gone through bankruptcy with their businesses in the past. Anyway, I hope that answered that one.
we were coming back from Canada a number of years ago through Kentucky, and I saw a sign, Lincoln's original birthplace. And you wander off the highway, and it's a state, I think it's a state park. I don't think it's even a federal park. And to your point, when you see where this guy came from, even at that time, there were some wealthy people in America in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, leading up to his presidency. The Lincoln family wasn't one of them. They were, when you think of that terrible expression of poor white trash, their picture was in next to that advertisement. One room. And share the story a little bit, though, the impact that his stepmom had on him, because I think that's where his evolution started.
When he was, I believe he was 9 years old, he was either 7 or 9. He was 9. His mother got milk sickness, and they were living in Illinois out on government land, out in the middle of the woods. And there wasn't any doctor or medicine anywhere close. There was nothing that could be done for her, and she passed away. So the father realized, I need some help. I have 2 kids out here in the middle of the wilderness. They're not old enough to really help me. I can't raise them by myself. He went back to his previous home, I think it was in Kentucky, and he found out that a lady had recently been widowed that he knew. So he went to her home and proposed to her. He knocked on the door, she came to the door, and he proposed to her, and the next day they got married. The proposal was funny because he was illiterate, and it wasn't the most romantic, but you can read about that in the book. She packed up everything she had and her children and into a wagon, and they headed back to Illinois. When she got there, they got along very well, and she just loved him. She just realized that there's something special about this kid. She took him under her wing, and saw that he got to go to school. Now, he didn't get to finish school, but he got to go part of the first grade. His father wanted him back working on his little farm there in the middle of the woods. So he pulled him out of school, but he learned enough to start reading. He learned that he liked to do arithmetic, he liked to read, and she brought all of the books that she had with her, which was quite a few because she was literate. And she shared all the books, and he read every book that she had, which was a pretty nice little library for that day. Had that not happened, I don't see how Lincoln could have gotten past that step without her. And he gave her credit all the way up through, he didn't have any latter years, but when he was grown, he continued to give her credit for his education. And he loved her very much. They loved each other just as if they were a real blood family.
It goes back to that old statement, right? All leaders are readers.
That's right. That's the first quote in the book.
And you know, I love the fact that in the book, Dennis, that you included part of his reading list, which people aren't really going to be able to see the list itself, but there's part of Honest Abe's reading list, which includes some great books. Aesop's Fables, The Life of Washington, of course. Presidents always seem to study other presidents. The Bible, of course. Don Juan, a variety of different poems. Robinson Crusoe, which probably led to his great love of nature, because he was a nature lover. The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. That's a good one for a president to read. Mormonism, which was a new religion at that point that he read, etc. So once again, all leaders are readers, all readers are leaders. It just, it was that in Abe's time. I was passing through, I was in Indiana a number of years ago. And on the way back here to Dallas, we were driving with the kids. And we had a remarkable experience that we went to Springfield, Illinois. And in Springfield, Illinois, of course, is where he was prior to being president and where his law practice was. And if any of our listeners get to Springfield, Illinois, which is about an hour from St. Louis. So if you're in that area of the country, it's well worth the visit. to, by the way, they don't send me a royalty for advertising Springfield, Illinois Chamber of Commerce is not sponsoring our show. Maybe they will, Dennis. I don't know. You never know. Maybe we should call them. But they've kept, I don't know if have you been there to Springfield?
No.
They've kept the actual town square where his home was like on one side of the street, and then you walk down the street a little bit on the other side where his law practice was. And they've kept this whole area, all the houses, they've kept them up through the Historical Society there, as well as keeping the original train at his body after his assassination was brought back to. He is buried there. You can visit the cemetery there where he and his family are buried. But really interesting to see that time period, and they've done a great job of keeping that. But along those lines, here's something about Lincoln that I learned on that visit. There are no Lincoln heirs. The family died off. Todd Lincoln, who I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you may or may not know this, Dennis, but I believe he became Secretary of the War Department under Grant, if I'm not mistaken. It may have been later than that even. But Todd Lincoln was the last heir. And when his youngest child passed away, that was the end of the Lincoln family, unfortunately, to my knowledge, here in America. And it's sad. Most of these presidents, they have offspring 3, 4, 5 generations down the road. But just a side note. But getting back to Lincoln, he did something too, and I'd love your thoughts on this, that to me was very unique. In that, and maybe it was this time period, and I don't know enough to comment on this one way or another. You may or may not. But he actually brought the people who ran against him in the election into his cabinet.
He did.
Now, that brings up to me the fact that this was a guy very confident in his beliefs, because he did not want a bunch of yes men around to just tell him how smart he was and how good looking he was and how articulate he was. And Abe, you're the best, you're the best, you're the best. He brought in people who would tell him, hey, Abe, you're not the best. That's a stupid idea. That's not going to work. And by doing that, he shows a tremendous amount, once again, and you've brought this out in these chapters very well, about his character and his belief in right and wrong.
I agree. But I also know that the quote that says, keep your friends close and your enemies closer, I actually think that's probably more the reason to try to be able to semi-control what was going on.
Yeah, I didn't think of it that way, but it's a good point. He was smart enough to do that. You hear what these guys have to say, because they're saying it probably outside of here too. Yeah, another thing about Lincoln that most people don't know: Abe Lincoln is a member of the U.S. Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Wow.
Yeah, he was back then what they call 𝐶 wrestling, which is pretty much what high school wrestling is here in Texas and pretty much throughout Iowa and a lot of the states that high school wrestling is pretty big in. Abe was a wrestler, and apparently he was very good. He was undefeated. So we that wrestled, we always claim him as one of ours, which he was. And he's a member of the Wrestling Hall of Fame in Stillwater, Oklahoma.
Wow.
And with legitimacy, like I said, because it's not that far back. They documented matches, and I forget who they wrestled. No Olympics back then, of course, or anything like that. But so he was an athletic guy, as well as being so gifted with oratory skills, needless to say.
He was even smarter than most people realize, because he suffered from depression. And the medicine that was prescribed to him, we know now, was the worst thing he could have possibly taken. And it affected his mental ability. It aged him. Look at pictures of him from the time he was 51 till he's 56. He aged 30 years. It doesn't even look like the same person. Of course, he was under a tremendous stress. He was the president during a civil war where Americans were killing each other. But he had a lot of health issues. But in spite of that, he was still able, and had he not been president, I think the South would have probably won the war. He used technology to the fullest extent possible. In other words, the technology of the day was the telegraph. And he would be in contact with the generals during the battles and tell them exactly what he wanted them to do, where the South didn't have the capability, didn't have the communication capabilities that the North did. Of course, they didn't have the money and they didn't have the food. It's amazing they stayed in the war as long as they did. But I don't think the North would have won had Lincoln not been in charge.
I agree with you, actually, and I've looked at both sides of the war over the years. I'm not a Civil War historian, but I'm fascinated with it. I've been to Gettysburg, I've been to Vicksburg. I grew up not far from West Point, the military academy, which is interesting in its own as a sidelight to our conversation here, which is so compelling for me. Hopefully, it's for our listeners as well. There were 300 generals on both sides that attended West Point.
Wow.
So when we say it was cousin versus cousin, it was also classmate versus classmate, including Lee and Grant. You know, Lee was a few years older than Grant, but they passed different times. Grant actually served under Lee in a war prior to the Civil War. These guys were contemporaries. In this day and age, they would have been on each other's Facebook. But getting back to Lincoln and his leadership, because Lincoln's leadership, to me, is so compelling, and why I have such tremendous respect for not only his presidency, but for him as a human being. That Civil War tore the country in half, literally.
Mm-hmm.
And when he could have been very aggressive at the end, okay, when Grant is going to visit with Lee, Lincoln knows about the meeting. I'm sure they're talking about it through the technology he just described. And he basically tells Grant, you let them have their pistols and you send those boys home to their farms and their families. You don't embarrass them. You don't humiliate them.
Had Lincoln lived for 5 or 6, 10 more years, the South wouldn't have gone through the terrible process it went through. Before the Civil War, Mississippi was the richest state in the Union. After the Civil War and after Lincoln was killed, they were punished. And Mississippi still hasn't recovered from the Civil War. When you drive into Mississippi, I went to Mississippi State. And when you drive into Mississippi from any other state, I don't know if it's still that way, but it was when I was in college. When you saw the sign, the roads immediately went to terrible. You went from a really nice paved good road to big potholes. So it was tough to drive and very poor still after 150 years. So it was, if Lincoln could have just lived a little bit longer, the whole country would have come together so much faster because he had compassion. But after he was gone, there was very little compassion in the North for the South.
Oh, no. The war continued in many ways long past its termination. But you go back to his compassion for people and to that point, because his wife had a lot of mental issues. They lost a child, and that affected her in a big way. Needless to say, understandably. But so here's this guy, this very ordinary guy, likes to read, likes to wrestle, likes to farm, interested in a multitude of different things, gets elected at a point where they really don't know who to elect. He's like the lesser of all the evils. If you think about it, there were some big names that were running for the office, but basically they were like, let's put Abe because Abe's not controversial. Abe's just Abe. And they never saw him as a long-term president. At the time, they just saw him as a temporary, he'd be there 4 years and be on to the next guy. And somehow he wins that election. Very close, by the way, very close election. To a more seasoned politician, by the way, on the other side.
Well, he actually won by a landslide the way the voting was counted. But he shouldn't have won at all. All the Democrats had to do was to put up someone that they all agreed on. If they could have just come up with a candidate, any candidate would have beat Lincoln. But at the end of the Republican convention, the Republicans were afraid that their party was going to split, and it actually did, so that there were two parties. What they didn't know was going to happen was that because of slavery, the Democrat parties split up and they couldn't agree. So they formed two parties. So now there were four parties, and in the end, there were five. So in the Electoral College, Lincoln won handily because so many votes went into so many different. There were 10 states that wouldn't even let Lincoln on the ballot. So, yeah, I mean, he shouldn't have. That's what the book story is about. It's about all the reasons he shouldn't have won and how he came through one after another. And there was an assassination attempt on him before he became president, and the bullet went through his high hat. You know that?
Yeah, I do know that. Matter of fact, if I'm not mistaken, I could swear that hat is in the Lincoln Library there in Springfield. I might be wrong. It might be the Smithsonian. I've seen it. I've seen the hat. It's somewhere the hat's been kept. And of course, those they used to call those what is it? Stove top?
Stovepipe.
Stovepipe, because it looked like the old pipes coming out of the ceiling on the top of the roof. But he was a guy that I don't think could ever really lose an argument, but where he was so smart was he would hear the other person's point of view as opposed to vilifying them. He embraced them. I think that was one of those character things that he had that only a few people throughout history I can think of. I can think of Reagan and Churchill as two others that would say, "Hey, Dennis, you and I have a difference of opinion here, but let me hear what you have to say."
Right.
And rather than make you feel foolish, just let me tell you how I see it.
That's one of the big reasons that he got the popularity, where people learned about him, was the Douglas debate, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They should have never happened. Lincoln was an unknown. Douglas was a very popular politician and went on to win his Senate race. But Lincoln decided, I'm going to follow him from stop to stop. And when he speaks, then I'll speak. Then he got the idea, what if we speak together? So he sent him a letter and offered. He says, well, why don't we just debate? I'm going to be there anyway. Well, Douglas didn't want to be called a coward. And he thought, I'll just put this unknown nobody away, which was a mistake because he did elevate him to his level. And it wasn't until later, see, there were hundreds of, the media of the day were newspapers. There were hundreds of reporters at all of those debates, and they wrote down the things that were being said. So later on, someone took all of those reports and put them together and published them, and it made Lincoln really look good because he was such a great debater and such a good orator. And so many people agreed with what he was saying what has to do with slavery. He was not big on stopping slavery. No. What he wanted to do was bring it in over time. And that's exactly what he said in the Lincoln-Douglas debate. Anyway, if you haven't read the book, if you haven't read the story, it's really an interesting story. And you'll be amazed at all of the things that could have derailed him that didn't. And some of them came down to just one little vote or one little thing. When he left the Republican convention, he was convinced he couldn't win. He couldn't. There was no way. All the Democrats had to do was come up with a name. That's it. And they would have won, and it would have been landslide, hands down, no way, because the Republicans were brand new. It was a new party. Most people didn't even know the name of the guy that they chose.
Well, that was the amazing part. He was really a quote unquote stopgap because you had, let's see, you had coming up in the food chain, you had a couple of what would become major generals, not only Grant, but you also had James Garfield from Ohio, who also ironically got assassinated. People don't think of him as assassinated because he got shot and he lived for, I think it was 12 days. And they foolishly sent him to New Jersey, to the Jersey shore, thinking that the salt air somehow would cure the bullet wound that he had. And it got infected, unfortunately, because salt will tend to infect that type of thing. And it infected and actually killed the guy. He made, in the state of Washington, he may have lived, I don't know on that. But Garfield was coming up. Garfield was very popular in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, in those states. He was very well known, and he was a career military guy. And then, of course, you had Grant coming up, and you had all these other famous generals that were already floating around before the Civil War, including a guy by the name of Robert E. Lee, who was pretty well known and pretty well respected in the North and the South. So it was, once again, who's this? Who's this nobody? It's kind of as a parallel, I think, back to Bill Clinton. And I'm certainly not a big Bill Clinton guy, but at the end of the day, kind of, I remember living in New Jersey, working in New York. It was like, Arkansas? This guy's from Arkansas? He might be president. It was almost like, who? Like, he's not from California or Illinois or New York or one of the quote unquote major powerful states, or Texas for that matter. And he did it. But let's come back to the story, though, because a couple of points in the story I want you to talk about a little bit. What would Lincoln have done if he had lived? We already talked about it a little bit. Okay, the South, obviously, we feel would have been in a much better situation than it was. But what else do you think he would have done? Because he had some mandates in mind for his second term.
He would have put a lot of money in the South rather than taking it out. He would have tried to cure the nation, bring people back together. We already said compassion. He had compassion. And once he was gone, the compassion was gone, and the South really took it out. The North really took it out on the South and wanted to hurt them. And they did really bad. I know had Lincoln survived and been able to stay around, he wouldn't have allowed the things that did happen to happen, which is really unfortunate. A lot of people suffered, both black and white. A lot of people suffered because of that. And the people that took his life had no idea what they'd done.
Let's come back to something along those lines. Lincoln had a plan for the South. He also had a plan for the North. When the assassination happened, it was a group plot, if you recall.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering, this isn't in the book. This is me asking you this as somebody else who's a fan of Lincoln in that time period. It's always crossed my mind that the people who were on the list that night, that were attacked, by the way. Okay, Secretary of State was attacked in his bed, if I recall correctly. The vice president was on the list, but somehow he wasn't where he was supposed to be. Obviously, Lincoln got assassinated. Grant was to be assassinated. At the last minute, his wife said, "Hey, we haven't seen your kids in months. They're home tonight. We can skip this show and let's go home." So he avoided it. But there's always gone through my mind, and we'll never know the answer to this, but do you think there was more to that plot by some of those insiders that he had? Because that's what always crosses my mind.
There's no doubt about it. Yeah, you just need to look into it. It won't take you long to find that it was a conspiracy from both sides. He should have been guarded, and for some reason, the president just wasn't guarded that night. Isn't that amazing? But he had enemies on both sides, and of course, at the end of the war, he wanted the war to end. That's why I didn't cover the war, because the people of the South had some good complaints. As the war drug on, he finally realized, I'm going to have to do some things that I really don't want to do. So he sent Sherman through and just burned he killed everybody. Anybody that was in a city, they burned the cities down, they killed. It was really brutal. And the people in the South hated Lincoln for that. I guess his justification is, I grew up in the South, and if you still go to some of those museums in the South and read some of the letters that were written by the Southerners, you get a different picture of what was going on during those days, and especially in Mississippi. But anyway, the book doesn't cover that. I stopped for that reason, because Lincoln was admirable up until the time I stopped.
Yeah.
Okay. Then he got into the war and some of the decisions that he made. But you have to remember, he was on drugs, really, really on drugs. He had terrible headaches, severe depression, and what they were giving him was a powerful drug that would have killed him anyway. He probably wouldn't have lived for another year. And you can just look, of course, it's a good thing there are a lot of pictures, and you can follow the pictures and see the deterioration in the man. I've read some things where doctors predicted he wouldn't have lived another year anyway. He was so sick. And if he continued to take what they were giving him, it would have killed him. And it did just the opposite. It made him worse. Instead of helping the depression and the headaches, it made him worse, and it made his health worse, and he couldn't think as clearly. I'm not sure he would have done what he did at the end of the war had he not been in that condition. Yeah. But who knows? I know this. Most of the people in the South really hated him, because a lot of property was destroyed and a lot of young people and women and children died that probably didn't have to happen. The South, by the end, the North was going to win the war anyway. It was just going to take a lot longer.
Well, the numbers of the Northern troops versus the Southern troops was almost double.
And money. They had money. They had the equipment. They had the technology. The only thing the South had was heart. That was it. Yeah. And it was amazing. At the end of some of the battles, the Northern soldiers would stand up and applaud because the Southerners would attack, run into their guns, just yell and run. It was a sad time. It was really a bad time for our country. Mm-hmm.
Something I found interesting was that Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, and I hope I don't get any historians that listen. I get letters from them that I got this wrong, but I want to say it was either her brother or her uncle that was a Southern, I don't know if he was a general or not, but he was some rank. And after the war, he came to live at the White House. When we think of this time period and why we can never allow this to happen again in our country, families were just so torn apart by North and South and what your politics aligned to. And a lot of times it was just based on geography. You know what I mean? A lot of people, when we came to America, including my family, we weren't here during the Civil War, we came after. But they came to Port of New York because that's where you left Europe. That's where they dropped you off. And others went to the Port of Charleston because that's where they dropped you off if you left from Italy or from Portugal or some of the Southern European. So a lot of times it was just where you ended up. But your cousin from London might have gone from the southern route because for whatever reason they were there. They wound up living in Atlanta. You wound up living in New York. You're fighting your cousin, shooting at each other, or maybe even a brother. That's how crazy that war was. And to preside over that, especially as a man with a conscience. This is a guy with a conscience from a little boy brought up reading the Bible and the gospel.
Right. Who loved the country.
To see all of that death and decimation on both sides and then say, I got to repair it. It took a special human being. And you titled this right, by the way, in my opinion, Providence, because it was Providence. He was the right guy. And maybe as we go back through history, maybe that's why what happened, not justifying assassination, obviously, but maybe that's why it happened. Maybe as opposed to him dying from the drugs a year or two later in bed after the war, as maybe a sad person, we think of him in a different light the way that it happened, albeit tragic. But nonetheless, it's okay. Maybe it had to end that way because it was such a violent period in our country.
And it, by it happening that way, there's so much interest, even now, how many years later, 150, 160, that still Lincoln is probably the most read about American that's ever lived.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, when I was writing the book back 5, 6 years ago, there were 16,000 books on Lincoln. 16,000. I think there's 19 now, and then I have mine. So 1901.
I knew there was a lot because I got about 18 myself.
Yeah.
Got a bunch on him, a bunch on Reagan, and then miscellaneous presidents. But those two I've got the most on. But let's go back to something though too. Okay, we talked about reading early on because there's so much. We could do a whole series on Lincoln, right? people make a living off of Lincoln. But you go back to that. If young Abe doesn't have his mother die, tragedy number one.
Mm-hmm.
This other woman come into his life, fortunately, with some level of education, right, where she could read, which was a big deal. By the way, people, let's remember the time period we're talking about here.
Yeah, there were no schools.
Yeah, there was no school. So if you could read, you were privileged that you could read because most people, male and female, could not.
Right.
So here this lady comes into his life. How important was she as a mentor?
Ultimate. That was the first major step. If his blood mother had lived, we wouldn't know the name Lincoln.
Yeah.
That's how important the second mother was.
Yeah.
Because she found a school, although it was a long way away. She enrolled him and got him to go there. We learned enough about reading in less than a year that he was able to continue to learn. And then her nephew came and lived with him. I think his name was Dennis, and taught him the ABCs. And he was so interested in learning. And she had those books. And what a great list of books she had. A wonderful list for him to learn about America and to read things that were interesting. So had she not come along, Lincoln's name wouldn't be known. Yeah. And then I believe the next thing was where the flatboat got marooned in a town that had a debate society. I think that was the next big. Had that not happened, we wouldn't know Lincoln, because the owner of the flatboat said, "I'm going to come back here and build a general store. Lincoln, do you want to come with me?" And when he said yes, that was the next step, because the people heard his stories, and they said, "Oh, you need to go join the debate club. You'd be great." And so that's how he got into politics. Once he got into the debate club, everybody heard him speak, and they said, "Oh, you need to go into politics." And so they pushed him in to the state government. He lost the race, but everybody knew who he was. He failed and failed and failed, and then he became president. But actually, he did have some success. He did become an attorney, a really respected attorney.
There's that graphic that pops up once in a while about failed, became president. That people post on Facebook or whatever, and it's true. That's the amazing part, is that this guy should not have been, by all intents and purposes, if you look historically at any president, the new one, the last one, the ones before that, all generally elite people in one way, shape, or form, be it intellectually, school, et cetera, going to the best schools. How many of our presidents have Harvard or Yale links? I forget the number, but it's a dramatic number.
Right.
But not Lincoln. Nothing. And yet he was so good at what he did. And I think there's another point to that too, Dennis, is because he wasn't the common man. He knew the farm. You're in Springfield, Illinois to this day. You wander off of downtown Springfield, you're in farm country. You're in people get dirty for a living. They're out there with tractors and up before the sun and making their living off of the land to this day, 160 years later. So those were his clients. Those were the people he was trying to help back then.
Yes. And look how things fell into place. The flatboat owner came back and started a general store, and Lincoln slept in the back. Okay, but the store failed. I'm going really fast through this, but the store failed. But later on, after he had tried to be in business, someone came to him and said, I have a fully stocked general store that I'm going to give to you on credit. Nothing down, you just take it. He said, that was a pretty good deal. So he took it. Then this traveler came by who was going back east because he just couldn't handle the West, and his wagon was full of junk, full of everything he had. And he said, it's overloaded. Would you please look and see if you could take some? Lincoln only had 50 cents. All the money he had in the world was in his pocket. The store was failing. So he said, no, I don't want to look. And the guy was insistent, come look at my wagon. How about this old trunk, this old 𝐔𝐿, okay? What am I trying to say? Barrel, this old barrel. Come, just take this old barrel. He said, I'll give it to you for 50 cents. Lincoln was just so kind-hearted. He reached in his pocket and he pulled out his last penny and bought the old barrel and just put it in the back room. 3 or 4 months later, he thought, I could use this barrel. And he went and took the top off of it. There was something in it. It was old English law books. And when he saw those, he thought, oh, I can read these. There's something else to read, because he read everything he got his hands on. And he became interested in the law. Now, had that not happened, he wouldn't have become an attorney and wouldn't become president. So when I was writing this book, I only wanted to have really powerful stories in there. And the only reason Lincoln's story was in there in the first place was because I heard that he failed 16 times before he became president. And I did a little bit of research and wrote a little story. It's about 1.5 pages. And I came in and have a daily list, and the daily list said, take out the Lincoln story. And I thought, before I do that, I'm just going to do a little bit more research. And then I found one of these things. I don't remember which one, but it was one of these. And I thought, wow, had that not happened, we wouldn't know the name Lincoln. I wonder if there are any more. And I found another one and another one. And by that time, I was going, this is amazing. And another one. And you keep going to 20. And then I thought, this was providence. There's no way this could have been luck. And that's when it hit me. That's the name of the story. Providence. What a great name for the story.
Wow. You named it right, because all of that is Lincoln. You know what I mean? All of it is, once again, a guy who shouldn't have made it. A guy, like you said, we never should have heard of this name. Who was this guy? He was the right guy at the right. Look, if you put him after World War II, after Civil War, yeah, we think of some of the guys I mentioned earlier, certainly prominent figures. But if I said who was president after Grant, I'd have to think. Up to McKinley, I'd have to think. There were a couple of guys in between, but up to McKinley, I'd have to, and you and I are smart guys. We know this stuff, right? But if Lincoln had been born 20 years later, yeah, he was president. He did whatever. He did a couple of things. I don't remember what. And so he was born at the right time, and he was put in a very, you can't say the right situation, but he was put in a unique situation, and he performed so well. Getting back to Mississippi, I don't know if my dad is right on this or not, but I could swear Vietnam War, Mississippi lost the most people. And part of that was the education system in that state just never really caught up after the Civil War. It was always a state that was just there. I think it's improved, by the way. They do have a high-tech area there now that's improving some things, and the university system's helping. But to your point, it's a state that kind of got left behind because of its involvement in the Civil War and Vicksburg's role in the biggest battle in the southern part of the war, besides Gettysburg in the north.
I went to college at Mississippi State. And I can tell you this, they had the best food. Agriculture in the area was really good. I've gone to 5 or 6 colleges, and I've eaten it more. And the food there was just excellent. It was so that they were so proud of their agricultural department. And having said that, I'll say this. I want to say something nice about them. And I love Mississippi State, but I went to school at a small school in Alabama, and I struggled. I really struggled to pass. I did get my degree. When I went to Mississippi State, I made straight A's. The difference, there was a difference. And I'm not saying that to be derogatory. This was a long time ago.
Right.
But they still hadn't recovered. They still hadn't recovered in the 70s, really early 70s. But it's changed a lot in the last 50 years. And it was changing while I was there. The school was just becoming segregated. And I was a graduate student. And I don't know if I should tell this story or not, but my roommate was black. I had no problem with it. It was fine. But when I would show people who my roommate was, they would look around to try to find who I was talking about.
Huh.
This guy was a genius. He was so smart. And he's probably in Mississippi politics right now. He should have been governor. Boy, he was smart. His side of the room was immaculate. It was clean. Everything was in its place. And my side of the room had underwear hanging off the fan. It was disheveled. And I admired him so much. But people were shocked. And this was in the early 70s. It had only been a few years before when they had those murders.
Oh, yeah.
But they've changed so much. It's not that way anymore. But it took a long time for things in the South to settle out. The war really devastated the South, and it took a long time for them to get over it, where the North just went back to where everything was fine. And I don't know, I didn't live there, but I'm just imagining. Back in the 20s, when football was just getting big, where Yale was winning every year and Princeton, they were winning the national championship every year. I think Princeton's got 22 national championships in football. They're never mentioned, and I think Yale probably has that many or more. And the Rose Bowl they bring in the two best college football teams. Well, they were always from the Northeast. No, but this year, Washington had won all its games. And no one from the Northeast wanted to go and play Washington because they were really good. They had demolished everybody they played, even the Northeastern teams. So the only other team in the nation that was undefeated was Alabama. So they asked Alabama if they would come and play in the Rose Bowl that year. And Alabama said, yeah, that'd be great. They had to get on a train and travel all the way across the country and play. And so at halftime, Washington was winning. They were taking Alabama apart. The coach went in at halftime, and he only said one thing. He said, I thought you Southern boys were tough. That's all he said. And they came out and they defeated Washington. Now, that's not the grand part of the story. When they got on the train and came back and stopped in New Orleans, there were thousands of people there, thousands and thousands at every train stop from the time that the Civil War was still going on in their mind. And this was in the 1920s, like 22. And when a Southern team plays Notre Dame or Ohio State, at Michigan, there's still a lot of, you really want to beat those Big Ten teams. And that's still a carryover. Older people like me know it better than the kids of the day, but I can remember when you just hated Notre Dame. I grew up, I just hated Notre Dame. I didn't like them at all.
This is funny. When I first moved to Dallas some 30 years ago now, I dated a girl from Monroe, Louisiana. Now I'm from New Jersey. She's from Monroe, so we don't even understand half of what each other says sometimes with the colloquialism. But I had worked for a guy from Shreveport, so I got some of them I understood. Like you might Ken. Can I make a right up there? You might can. What does that mean? Does it mean I can or I can't? Stuff like that. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Some of our listeners don't. If you're in like California or New York, you have no idea what we're talking about. But anyway, this is like Louisiana colloquialisms. Anyway, we get invited to a wedding down in Alexandria. So we go to the wedding, lovely wedding, and it's at a plantation home. So between the wedding, when the wedding party's off doing pictures and you're roaming around and before the cocktail party and all of that, I go into the bookshop and I see the book section about the Civil War, or what I think is the Civil War. The books, most of them are titled about the War of Northern Aggression. Now I'm a stupid Yankee, so I call her over. Teresa, come here. What is this? She goes, shh. She goes, look outside the window there, John. I go, yeah, what am I looking at? She goes, pickup trucks, right? I go, yeah. She goes, what do you see in those pickup trucks? I said, shotgun racks. She goes, shut up. And I listened, by the way. She was right. But for me, as a guy growing up in the Northeast, I got the impact of the Civil War. I understood it historically, studied it in school, but I didn't get it till I moved to the South. Everything that happened on both sides, and Lincoln. I still have friends down here in the South that do not like Lincoln. When I say he was our greatest president, oh boy, I get an argument.
Yeah.
And I listen once again. Hey, I don't know what all. Tell me why. And some of their rationale is understood, and some of their rationale is, hey, look, he did what he had to do given the circumstances. But anyway, we could talk about that another time. But I guess my point about it is, just to sum this up, Lincoln, love him or hate him, historically, I think is one of our three most relevant presidents. And without him, to your point, the United States would have been a different country.
Right.
And it was a recovered country, and it may not have recovered in the way that it did if he was a guy who was vindictive and just wanted to win at all costs, so to speak, giving those men their dignity. And I transgressed for a minute here. I was in Hawaii a number of years ago. And sounds like I never work, by the way. I'm driving here. I really do work for a living, by the way. But we were in Hawaii, my wife and I, and we went to all the Pearl Harbor stuff. And we were on the Independence. The Independence was the ship that we signed the armistice with Japan, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you take a tour of the ship. And it's a former Navy person that takes you on the tour. And he explained that there's one part of the ship where a kamikaze pilot had hit the side of the ship, died, of course, trying to kill U.S. service personnel, unsuccessfully in that particular case. And I guess the guys on the boat, they just wanted to throw the guy in the ocean. And the admiral on the ship said, no, not going to do that. We are going to give him a proper burial with the Japanese flag. We're going to bury him the proper way off the bow of the ship. And I said to the guy, why is that? He said, because the admiral's rationale was both sides showed up to do what they thought was the right thing. Whether or not historically they were right, the South was right, the North was right, the serviceman or woman that shows up thinking, hey, I'm here to do my service to my country. The politics that start these things generally are not what that person is dealing with. They're just showing up doing what they think they're supposed to do. In some cases, have to do because they're automatically enrolled in a war system. So my only point is, I think of what Lincoln did in that case. I'd love your closing thoughts on this, Dennis. To do that and to give those men their dignity, so to speak. Take your side piece, go home. We're not putting you in jail. We're not killing you. The war's over. Go back. And even with Robert E. Lee, they could have done a lot to Lee that they chose not to do. And because once again, Lee was trained. He was trained to be a soldier. He just did what he was trained to do. wrong or indifferent. So anyway, I don't know where I'm going with that outside of to say that Lincoln was a man of compassion at a time when he could have been a guy who had nothing but animosity to destroy his opponent to the end, and instead let that opponent have dignity to try to rebuild a very difficult circumstance on both sides of the war.
I think that was his first step in a lot of steps he planned to take to heal the country. I think he knew that he pushed it pretty hard to get the war, to bring the war to an end. And had he lived longer, he would have shown a lot more compassion, because he was a compassionate man. He had a lot of integrity. The more you read about him, the more you like him. He was funny. He was well-spoken. He cared about the country. He really loved America, and that's why he wanted to keep it together. Lee loved America too, and he loved the law, and he was trained in West Point that the states had the right to withdraw if they wanted to, and that's why he led the Southern Army, because he knew they had the right to do that. A lot of people still today hate him. He wasn't for slavery. If you read about him, you really like him too. He was a quality person.
Very high. Very high.
Same way with Andrew Jackson, but they were just caught up in the times, and there was a lot of resentment from between the North and the South, and unfortunately it came to a head. And I guess it's a good thing that Lincoln was there when it happened, or it could have been an awful lot worse. As bad as it was, it could have been a lot worse.
There's one battle that comes to mind in Virginia, Northern Virginia, when Grant went in at Lincoln's request to fight the War of Northern Virginia, which was the Army of Northern Virginia, which was Robert E. Lee's, that was his troops. And the forest actually catches on fire at one point. I forget the circumstance how that happened. And it was so bad, I think more guys died in the fire on both sides, burnt to death. And remember, these are 17, 18-year-old kids. In some cases they were older, but in a lot of cases they were just kids, just showing up to do their proverbial duty. The tragedy of that war is once again why we as Americans have to remember we never want a repeat of it under any circumstance.
The majority and the Lincoln story in the book is all positive. We've gotten into some heavy thoughts, but the book was written to cheer people up, to bring them out of their depression and to be thinking about things that are positive and things where they want to go. And I hope everybody will get a copy and read the Lincoln story and the other stories.
There's so many stories in here. And I agree with you, because Lincoln to me is a compelling person. And yeah, we got into some of the minutia of the war, of course, but there's so many great stories in here. So we've done Mary Kay now, and we've done Abe Lincoln now, and we've done Og Mandino now, and we started off with Sylvester Stallone, somebody who's now ambassador to Hollywood. You didn't know that when you wrote the book. He would be an ambassador someday. And so, Dennis, where do we go from here? Okay, now you have, first of all, tell everybody where they can get the book. Now, if they're listening this far, they've probably heard our prior interviews, but just in case, tell them where to get the book.
realimpactbook.com. They can go there. There's a picture of Aladdin's lamp on the front of the book. If they want to know the mystery, right up in the left-hand corner, it says The Mystery of the Lamp. Go and listen to that. It's really good. And then before you leave, scroll down to the bottom where it says podcast attendee and get your free ebook. You won't be put on any list unless you choose to be notified when I write other books. I have some other books coming: 7 Secrets of Success, The Laws of Nature, and Burning Desire. And somebody really that you know really well and is really special is probably going to be in Burning Desire, and his first name's John. So that might be something that you want to know about. So if so, when you go there and get your free book, just click that little link that says, tell me when you finish your books. I have a real estate book coming out at the end of this month, How to Get Started Investing in Real Estate. So if you have an interest in that, you might want to check that one out. But if you go to realimpactbook.com, you can find everything there. Everything, that's a good starting place. If you want to get in touch with me, up at the top, it says contact us, has my phone number, email address. I'm easy to contact. So if you need to talk with someone or a speaker or whatever, and give me a call.
Dennis, this has been a privilege, and we've done 4 of these so far. We were only going to do 4, but because of the nature of this book, I'd love to do Walt Disney with you. Could we do that next week?
Oh, that's a good one.
I know.
I'd like to do Walt Disney. That's, well, probably my favorite. They're all my favorite, but Disney's special. His life's got nothing to do with what's happening with Disney now.
Oh, no.
Totally different, but
turning over in his grave, I would imagine.
Yeah, to see what he went through. He really, of course, we just finished Lincoln, so it's hard to eclipse that. But if you could, Disney did.
I tell you one fast story. I was in Germany a number of years ago, and we're wandering up this mountain to go to this castle that they don't tell us that the castle is the castle that he made the castle in Florida from. That he went and he took the pictures. This was in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. And the castle in Florida is exactly what in Germany. Every nook and cranny. It's incredible, the detail.
Wow.
And given that he didn't have the modern technology that we had, of photographic equipment and all the stuff that you take the pictures and you bring them back to a good illustrator and they'd be able to replicate things a lot easier. He had an amazing mind. But we'll talk about that more next week.
Sounds great. I look forward to it.
Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you for tuning in. Be sure to check back weekly for more exciting episodes. And don't miss Ink and Insight every Wednesday, where we celebrate iconic authors and dive into their impactful works.